Hi guys, I'm going to be doing a video today about the autism scandal of autistic children and autistic young people and people with learning disabilities being locked in mental health units and psychiatric units. And just now I pre-recorded the first part of the BBC introduction from the Jeremy Vine show from the 20th of May, and he basically was introducing the topic, and I disagree with the terminology he used. He used the terminology psychiatric units. It's not necessarily a psychiatric unit. I disagree with that terminology. It is a mental health treatment unit or assessment treatment unit, so he needs to be really careful with the terminology. So I just want to put my thoughts on that first introduction piece, and you'll be getting my reaction to each piece of the interview. I'm going to be doing my own thoughts and feelings on it. So I will let you know on the next piece. See you soon.
Jeremy Vine Show, BBC Radio 2. You are most welcome this Monday. Today, children, especially those with autism and learning disabilities, are being admitted to psychiatric hospitals when they shouldn't be. The model railways with autism and learning disabilities are being admitted to mental health hospitals unnecessarily, according to research by the Children's Commissioner for England. Anne Longfield's report found that children were not given enough support in school or in the community, which meant that some ended up in institutions for months or even years. In February this year, 250 children with autism or a learning disability were in mental health hospitals, compared to 110 children 4 years ago. Maybe this is something you've experienced in your family. If you want to share your story and tell us what you think of today's report, you can call us 08000 288 291, email vine@bbc.co.uk. We hope to speak soon to Anne Longfield herself, the Children's Commissioner. But first, let's go to Isabel Garnett, who's mother of Matthew, campaigner for Human 2. Just tell us, Isabel, about Matthew's situation.
Hi guys, I'm back again. I've just recorded the next piece of the interview introduction. Jeremy Vine was saying that apparently now that there is more autistic children and young people with learning disabilities locked up in mental health institutions and psychiatric units than there was 4 years ago. This doesn't surprise me, but the fact is that, again, there is no reasoning behind these statistics. He hasn't explained why the figures are so high, and this is due to what I feel is a misunderstanding of autistic children and adults. When you have autism, it is a communication disorder, and a lot of the time, especially children, are not able to communicate their needs or communicate their behaviour in a clear and safe environment, so therefore they get mislabelled or mistreated as having a psychiatric condition or psychiatric disorder, and then they end up being assessed and put into a mental health assessment or treatment unit. And the problem is that it's the most unsafest place for us to be going. We are not mentally unwell. We are more than physically capable of looking after ourselves most of the time. But again, he hasn't really said why the figures are so high or what it means for autistic people and their families. The problem is this means that autistic people are often moved away from their own families and then moved away miles upon miles upon miles away from home. So I'm going to be interested to what he says next. But that's shocking, that the fact that young people the amount of young people are now doubled than they were 4 years ago. So I'll keep you updated. Talk to you again soon. Bye.
He also has ADHD, and he has generalised anxiety and other co-occurring conditions that can occur with because it's neurological. But unfortunately, his comorbidity, the co-occurring conditions weren't diagnosed until he began to reach crisis point.
Right.
Basically, there was Matthew's case. It's not just my opinion. There's actually a case review commissioned by former Care Minister Alistair Burt. He commissioned a case review into Matthew's case that found that Matthew's section in crisis was predictable and preventable.
Can you just take us back to what actually happened, Isabel? So he's 15, and what were the circumstances?
So he, by that stage, following many battles to get him the right support in school, followed by many exclusions from mainstream school, we finally managed to get him to a specialist autism placement, which was really good after many years of having to fight for him.
Right.
But when he hit puberty, he's always been severely affected by his autism, but his behaviour changed. His behaviour pattern changed. It became much more. His distressed behaviour became much more unpredictable. Because in the past we could tell when he was getting to sensory overload and we could do something about it, whereas this time it would happen very, very quickly, and sometimes it would seem we didn't know where the outburst had come from. Also he began to his self-talk, which he's always had. It's kind of called echolalia. It's sometimes a feature in autism. Changed quality too. So the psychologist who is working with Matthew in his specialist school suggested that Matthew might be having psychotic episodes, and she suggested that we ask for a psychiatric assessment, which we did. We asked Matthew's paediatrician to refer us to CAMS, and unfortunately that's when things deteriorated. Well, that was the start of things getting really, really bad for Matthew.
Because they started to take him down a medical track, did they?
Precisely. In fact, nothing happened. I can't remember. It was a matter of, months and months and months. We were waiting for help. He was diagnosed with ADHD at that point in time, and possibly with autistic catatonia, but there was a question mark around that. We were told if it gets too bad, call 999. And one day it got too bad, and the police came and they spoke to the psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist said, take him into A&E. That's what happened, and he was sectioned there. And at that time we were told he needed assessment and treatment, and we of course were very concerned, but we wanted what was best for our son, and we wanted to work, we wanted to trust the professionals and work collaboratively with them.
And so he ends up in hospital for 18 months, is that right?
Yes, he does. So
is there not, I
12
suppose...
weeks turns into 18 months.
Understood. Now, you've got a lot of medical professionals who've been involved in that, and I guess what they're doing is they're saying we're not here treating the conditions the lifelong conditions of autism and ADHD. We're treating what is a kind of eruption of difficulty for him with the catatonia that you mentioned, and they wondered if it was psychosis or whatever. So they think they're treating something that is just transient.
Absolutely, it's not even that. It's a misdiagnosis.
Okay, but they were dealing with a situation that was overwhelming you, I guess, is what they thought they were doing.
Well, just to bring it back into perspective, the case review said that had Matthew had the joint working of education, health and social care, he would never reached that crisis. And the reason why we can say that with conviction is because Matthew does not have psychosis, and actually he was seen by a psychiatrist, a second opinion, who did have neurodisability experience and who recognised that anxiety was the big feature in Matthew's presentation, and so that is what his care now is informed by that knowledge. It's got nothing to do with Matthew being mentally ill. It's got everything to do with him having learning disability and autism.
Understood, but the two things obviously
have personalised care.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we can see how the two things can get confused in a high pressure situation where someone calls 999, but for you're then left for 18 months trying to get your son out of hospital.
Yes, precisely.
Hi guys, it's me. I'm back again. I'm here to talk about the next piece of the interview. He was currently interviewing a mother of a severely autistic young lad called Matthew, and the mum was called Isabel. And I'm a bit shocked at his lack of understanding towards her, considering that she is a mother of a severely autistic young adult. He seemed to not really want to understand her. He kept trying to intervene every time that she was speaking, and this is a difficult topic for everyone to talk about, not just the broadcaster himself, but the mum was really obviously genuinely upset. She was worried about her son, and the state of the UK scenario on autism and mental health hospitals is really, really quite shocking and awful. But from my perspective as an autistic adult, this really does worry me, because again, it seems the neurotypical population don't really have much understanding when it comes to autism, or even learning disabilities or mental health issues for that matter. And once someone with severe autism is transferred to a place like that, it is difficult for them to adjust to their new environment. They're having to go with strangers who don't know nothing about their background or who they are or what conditions they have. And when you have autism, you often have heightened emotions and anxiety disorders as well. So for this guy Matthew, he was obviously frustrated, highly emotional, highly anxious. He was having to go into a mental health hospital and be restrained and drugged. And this is completely inappropriate treatment and care for someone on the autistic spectrum. Putting us into a place like that to begin with is just not on. And I knew from the sound of the interview that that was the last resort for the mum to do that. And she was obviously working with the professionals who decided that was in the best interests of her son to go into the mental health hospital. But at the same time, it seemed that the professionals had no idea about how to care for Matthew, or his sense of well-being, or what he was able to cope with and what he wasn't able to cope with. Again, it's all about miscommunication. And I feel that Jeremy's not been really particularly that fair to the mum. She's trying to talk about her son and the experiences they both go through. And I feel that he was just constantly trying to interrupt her. And as someone with autism, I feel that was a bit disrespectful and rude. Like, he's inviting her to tell her story, then constantly stopping her and constantly wanting to jump in with the questions all the time. I know that's part of the interview, but if you invite someone on to talk about a subject this tough and this hard-hitting to everybody, you're going to have to expect her to want to talk a bit about it and explain what her son is going through with the system. The system isn't fit for purpose, and to be honest, she was really explaining it in a good way. I really found it helpful to listen to her. So Jeremy needs to be a bit more understanding and flexible when it comes to the questioning. I think he hasn't really practiced it, or he hasn't really looked into the research. So I shall let you know on the next piece. Bye, guys.
He was restrained, he was secluded, and since he stepped out of that place, the moment he stepped out, he hasn't been restrained, he hasn't been secluded, he hasn't been contained for 2.5 years.
Well, that tells its own story, Isabel, doesn't it?
Precisely.
Thank you. Thank you very much for talking to us. Mother of Matthew, campaigner for a group called Human 2, but very concerned about this story that we're doing today about children with learning difficulties or autism that's somehow being confused with mental illness, and they end up in hospital. Longfield, who's joined us and who heard the interview with Isabel, and I'm worried you're going to tell me that's typical, that story.
It is typical, yeah, and I've met with Isabel and other parents as well, and honestly, in this role, you get to hear some pretty kind of traumatic events, but meeting that group of parents, I just came away so shocked. They were tears of frustration and anger, and just that despair of what can we do? We want help for our kids, but they've been secured in this institution, and now we are stuck on the outside and not able to help shape anything that happens.
So her son had ADHD and autism, and then at some point, maybe because of puberty, adolescence, there's a bit of a mental health crisis, or whatever you want to call it.
Right.
And the psychiatrist gets involved, and the psychiatrist says, go to A&E.
That's right.
At that point, the game's up, isn't it?
Well, yes, the crisis hits, and often it's that point where the kids get bigger and, you say, they move towards their teenage years. Somehow crisis hits. Now, of course, as Isabel say, you know, if this had been prevented from happening, if we could have had support at home, crisis could have been avoided. But crisis hits, and as ever, there's a panic. Children get admitted into an institution, often being told it's for kind of 2 months or 3 months. That turns into 6 months, can be turned into a year, many more as well. 2.5 years. We've seen that as a maximum stay there. And what that means then is that those children are in a place very much institutionalised. They're frightened. They don't know what's going on.
Drugged
many
as
miles
well.
away from home. Parents can't visit.
Given drugs to...
Absolutely. Yeah. They're often restrained because of behaviour. They're put on seclusion and sedated. And all of those things happen, often without the parents knowing. And there's just this ongoing slippage in terms of assessing them to be able to come out. Because, of course, the same problem is there at the end of the day. The community care that wasn't there in the beginning isn't there at the end for them to come out, and they get stuck.
And in Matthew's case, maybe many like him, I guess the experience of being in these institutions is troubling, and you possibly become more troubled while you're in there.
Well, children have told me, I used my powers to go in, and our team went in and talked to children who'd been in there and were in there now. And quite a lot of children were saying, look, hospital is making us worse because we need people around us that we know, love and trust. We want that stability, and we keep getting different staff members coming on. We're not in a place that feels like home. It's many, many miles away from home, and we absolutely don't know when we're going to get out of here. Basic care needs were found to be missing. One child, their parents said that they hadn't been washed for 6 months. It's almost impossible to believe, but it's the reality for this really vulnerable set of children.
And it's a group which is, I know your report mentions autism, learning difficulties, that kind of area, is it?
That's right. So we've got here a group of children who, this is a lifetime condition. It's not something you get treatment for as such. And often...
Hi guys, this is my reaction to the next piece of the interview. Jeremy Vine saying that basically when autistic young people get put into mental health hospitals or mental health institutions, he said about the game being up. Jeremy, this isn't a game. Like, don't treat this issue as a game. Like, the way you said that was really patronising, and you're like, oh, once they get admitted into there, the game's up. It's not a game. We are individuals. We are humans. Like, you are making us out to be like some kind of game to be won, and it's like, oh, well, the game's up. Once you're in there, you're in there. We shouldn't even be getting admitted in there, so that was the wrong terminology for you to actually use, because you kind of dehumanised the whole autistic population. We're not a game. We are humans. We are humans who get misused, and we get put in the wrong places. We often get misdiagnosed with multiple things altogether, i.e. psychiatric disorders, personality disorders, behaviour disorders. Like the lady just said who you were talking to about getting put in restraints, that is the worst case. That should never, ever, ever, ever happen. We shouldn't be getting put in restraints. We shouldn't be given psychiatric drugs, because autism isn't a psychiatric issue. It's completely a neurodevelopmental condition. So if you say the game's up, that was just really, really patronising. That's really made me quite annoyed. So, yeah, you need to understand that you should have used better terminology there. And I know that you were trying to make a point, but be very, very careful with the wording that you use for the autistic community, because that is rather offensive. And, yeah, I think you just need to be very careful with the way that you come across with your medical terminology. But I do agree with what you're saying to the lady. I think that we are over-drugged, we are over-restrained, and I totally get about your viewpoint on that. I agree with you. But, yeah, just be very careful, and I will record my next piece shortly. Bye, guys.
Treatment there can be, but sadly, although some of it is good, sadly some of it fails that test.
So what needs to happen?
Well, we know so much more about these children than we did, and there are there's more reports coming out this week. The health secretary himself has been shocked by some of these revelations, but he now, I believe, needs to really oversee these 250 cases and make sure the plans and the money's in place to get them back with their families or in the community. But a bigger problem really he needs to fix, which is about getting the money in place to prevent children going in the first place.
Thank you very much, Anne Longfield, Children's Commissioner. Nicholas Ryan emails and says, I'm really sorry to hear the story of Matthew from his mum. I have a son with similar behaviour. We also called the police on occasion, as advised by the experts, and that's something I regret now, because it didn't help the situation. Now we just manage my son based on our experience and on common sense with no help, and that works much better. Judith McLean in Edinburgh says, when my son started primary school, he was struggling to focus, and they thought he might have ADHD, but we were told it would take up to 18 months for him to be seen. I think the main problem here is that the waiting lists are too long. If people were seen at an earlier stage, there wouldn't be as many referrals to psychiatric hospitals. In Northern Ireland, Enniskillen to be precise, we've got Neil. And Neil, sorry to hear your son is in a secure unit.
Good afternoon, Jeremy. Yes, he is.
Hi guys, this is my reaction to the next piece of the interview. I agree with Jeremy 100% what he just said about that the waits are too long for treatment and assessment for people with autism and learning disabilities. That is a huge problem in the UK, and I know that it is being worked on, and as someone who volunteers for our local autism service, I know that the wait in my local area isn't that bad now. I know that I think it's down to like a year's wait, I think, or 18 months. So, yeah, it's not that bad for my local area. But I know that some areas don't really have autism services set up or learning disability services set up to get quick assessment and access. But the problem is that the government needs to be putting more funding money into this situation, because the UK government should be backing us up a little bit more. We as adults and children on the spectrum or with a learning disability or a mental health issue, we should be getting the care that we are entitled to. And the problem is we don't. We often get mislabelled or mistreated or not believed that we have things wrong with us. And that comes down to lack of miscommunication or lack of communication with our needs. And as someone on the spectrum, we often have communication issues. So for someone like myself, if I get overwhelmed or stressed or anxious, sometimes I'll shut myself down because I get so overwhelmed with the information that I'm processing. I'm just not able to handle myself. And that means that sometimes I may just not want to talk to you, or may get fidgety, or I may not keep still. I may walk up and down, or I may talk too fast to the point where you're like, slow down, slow down, slow down. And that is, again, due to the anxiety in us. So, again, it's down to the government needs to make sure that we have our rights and we need to be understood. And it needs to be the appropriate treatment put into place, because half the time, if you're on the spectrum and if you've got a learning disability or a mental health issue, you are often judged to be mentally unfit or mentally incapable. And we're not. So, again, it comes down to the lack of money and resources. And also, it comes down to the lack of communication that parents have as well. If you live with your parents or you need your parents to help you, they should be the ones to have the rights to do that. A lot of the time, mental health facilities or treatment units or hospitals won't listen to your parents or carers. They only want to listen to you because it's you who is involved in the treatment. So again, it's about having their rights read and listened to, and also making sure you have that appropriate adult with you to support you. So for me, I have my mum, I have my dad, and other people, so I'm very, very lucky I'm able to have them if I need them to be with me. So yeah, it's all about respecting autistic people for their rights and making their voices stand out rather than just ignoring us like we're a number and like we are mentally incapable. We do want to help you, we do want to help educate you, and we do want to help make the treatment a lot more straightforward than it has been. And I think that's the trouble. There is that mismatch of communication. So thank you very much for listening, guys. Please give this a like, please comment, please share, and please subscribe to my channel if you like this content. Bye, guys.